This week on the Capitol Report, all eyes on Governor Malloy as the state budget that passed 2 weeks ago finally gets to his desk. Bipartisan budget talks resume between legislative leaders and the governor, and the state Supreme Court takes on the issue of school funding in Connecticut. Now, the week in review on the Capitol Report.
Don't worry, I'm not going to sign it.
The week began with Governor Malloy still waiting for the Republican-written budget to reach his desk after passing in the legislature with some key Democratic votes more than a week earlier. Despite his promised veto, the governor continued to draw attention to parts of the budget he and Democratic legislators do not like. On Monday, he was with UConn President Susan Herbst and Democratic legislators on the UConn Avery Point campus in Groton to criticize the Republican cuts to higher education.
In all likelihood, this campus is a campus that could be on the chopping block. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that to further disturb you. It's to rally you. Of course, cuts have to be made. That's why I proposed 4 different budgets. That's why I've moved every step of the way. Quite frankly, had to move on the UConn side to a number that I'm not happy with, but it was necessary to put together a budget that would protect the University of Connecticut as opposed to the budget that was passed, which is really, just a frontal assault. It's anti-intellectual. Let's be honest, that's what it is. You don't go after all of your educational institutions of higher learning to the extent that this budget does and say that you're for education or that you're for building the economy or that you're for placing people in jobs. You just don't do it.
We need the governor's budget passed so that we can still afford to distribute what we do now, $177 million in merit and need-based financial aid. That's a big number. With the kind of cuts that we're talking about here and the kind of cuts we're worried about over these last few days, financial aid is one of the few areas where we have cash available that was waiting for our students. Nearly all of our other monies are tied up in contracts. So contrary to some of the discourse that I've heard out there, we can't just find cash in increased alumni donations or federal grants. It just doesn't work that way.
Also in protest of the higher ed cuts in the Republican budget on Monday, Senate Majority Leader Bob Duff held a briefing with fellow Democratic legislators and students at Norwalk Community College.
We're able to analyze it further and to further be able to understand the impacts that it has on not only our entire state budget, but also individuals like our students here at Norwalk Community College. We want to make sure that we support higher education. We know one of the ways in which we grow our economy and how we continue to move Connecticut forward is to invest in higher education and secondary education. And so again, I call on my colleagues to come together, roll up our sleeves, work on a bipartisan budget that protects higher education, that doesn't cut $300 million from UConn, that doesn't cut $90 million from our state university system, doesn't eliminate the Roberta Willis Scholarship Fund, and that protects education throughout the state of Connecticut.
But 3 Republican legislators also attended the briefing to offer a different view of the budget that passed.
One of the reasons community colleges were cut, and there was a rescission, most definitely, there are 4 community colleges within 12 miles of Hartford. We are asking one of those to be closed. NCC is not going to suffer at all. NCC is I think, the most, that's my personal opinion, but I know the numbers back it up. It is the most vibrant and viable community college in the state of Connecticut. NCC will not see a cut in funding. So you all need to understand that.
And our view is, if there are things people don't like, there are things the governor doesn't like, let's talk about them. Let's talk about them now. We have a budget that passed with a majority of votes in the legislature. We don't need another one. We need to talk about things that perhaps, we can see small changes that might find another way. But we don't need to go any farther to a budget that didn't pass, can't pass, and that we don't have.
Jump ahead to Tuesday, when Governor Malloy invited Democratic and Republican leaders in the House and Senate to his office for renewed budget talks. The clock is ticking for the state to get a budget in place. Since July 1st, Governor Malloy has been running state government by executive order with limited resources. The hope was to get a budget passed and in place before October 1st so that the governor's limited spending plan for municipalities would not take effect. A budget was passed on September 15th, but not the one the governor and Democratic leaders expected. It turned out that 3 Democrats in the Senate and 5 Democrats in the House voted for the budget introduced by Republicans, securing final passage but an expected veto from the governor. At Tuesday's meeting, the prospect of a revised budget that could be bipartisan was discussed.
We had a good meeting, I thought, and we'll continue tomorrow. I'm hopeful that we'll get to a budget and resolve some of the issues that are before us. I don't think any of my concerns about the budget that I raised today were a surprise to anyone. There certainly are unresolved, which will probably give rise to a veto in the coming days.
Right now, the reality of our world in the state of Connecticut is there are 2 options on the table. He can sign the budget, the bipartisan budget that passed, or October 1st can come and go, and we know what will happen in October with education payments, with municipal aid. Now, I understand that everybody has issues with both possibilities. Nobody is saying this is perfect. I don't think that document exists. But we have to deal with the reality we're in now, and that's why we believe that the best way to go is to negotiate off of the budget that passed and move that forward. But having said that, we're certainly ready, willing, and able to sit down and have any conversations with our fellow leaders and the governor to try and move all of this forward.
Which we're going to do right now, so thank you.
One item that originally seemed to have everyone on the same page, the negotiated hospital tax increase included in both the Democratic and Republican budgets, hit a roadblock this week. The governor says that deal now needs to include the settlement of a lawsuit related to the state's reduced payments to hospitals starting in 2012, 1 year after imposing the hospital provider tax due to the state budget crisis.
It would be in the state's best interest, and quite frankly the hospital's best interest, particularly on the attorney cost side, to reach a comprehensive agreement. I think that's in everyone's best interest. If I was not acting as governor but as the attorney for the state, I would tell them to do that, and that's what we should do, to transfer $200 million plus per year to an entity without getting an agreement to settle claims doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Legislative leaders had planned to call a special session to approve the hospital tax portion of the budget this week, but that was before learning about the governor's intended revisions.
When we went into the meeting, as Senator Fasano said, I think we were all under the assumption that we would need to act by Friday in order to save the hospital deal. Secretary Barnes said he thought that was not necessarily the case, that there could be some other filing, an amendment to our state plan that could suffice to meet the October 1st deadline with more detail to follow, but would have to follow quickly within the next couple of weeks. So, that's the other threshold issue. Do we have to come in by the end of this week in order to do this or not? So he was actually under the opinion today that there was more flexibility than an absolute deadline of October 1st. And we were assuming until the meeting just now that it was an absolute deadline. So I think that's the first thing we have to determine.
But I think there's a general understanding that the governor would like to settle the entire case, one fell swoop, one piece of legislation, that is the independent case now pending in the courts with the hospital, and this tax, do everything all at once and be done with it and see if he could reach that.
There's the funding, the federal funding coming back to Connecticut, and then there's the universal negotiations that have been going on and will continue to go on. If it got to the point where there was no agreement on the universal negotiations and we knew that the hospitals were going to lose money, then that would clearly be something that would be of import to us, and we would take the steps we needed to take.
The administration very clearly said that their goal, first and foremost, is to help us and work with us to adopt a budget. The hospital piece is part of that. But there are discussions going on what exact language needs to happen as part of that, and we'll see what happens with those, and we'll decide Thursday what we're going to do.
After bipartisan discussions on Wednesday, the hospital issue remained unsettled.
The governor is still in negotiations with the hospital association, so we would like to make sure that they have every opportunity to continue those negotiations unencumbered by any
Right.
deal the legislature makes.
I think the most important issue in Connecticut is that we don't have a budget, and we got to get there, of which the hospital agreement could be a part, or quite frankly, may not be a part at all.
Meanwhile, on Wednesday, budget talks between legislative leaders and the governor got more specific.
What we were able to do is talk about the issues that we had differences on, and then really dig down to what those differences were. If there were numbers, if there were policy, if there were short-term, long-range differences. And I think that helps to understand each one's perspective, to see if we could go back, think about what each of us have said, and then come back and see if we can either come their way, come our way, or find some middle ground.
They're very serious conversations, and it's good to have them. That doesn't mean you end up with agreement at the end, but you have to have them to know if you have an agreement.
And I think one of the things that came up today is we keep saying bipartisan negotiations. It's really not. It's tripartisan. Right. You have the governor's office, you have House Democrats, you have House Republicans, Senate Democrat, and Senate Republicans. So it is a long negotiations. We all have differing opinions.
There's some distance between everyone. I think things will become clearer when we put out our statements on the budget. They'll make a decision whether they want to sit on their hands and wait to try to overturn that probable veto. But I'm hopeful we can get there. I just think we have to find a way to get there. I will stay in the room with folks. I will have the discussions necessary to do that. I'm constantly thinking of other ways that we could try to get this thing going faster.
As the week progressed, dueling briefings were held around the state, some calling on the governor to veto the budget that passed 2 weeks earlier, and others calling on him to sign it into law. After going through the legal review process, the budget document finally got to the governor's desk on Wednesday.
Apparently it arrived while I was in the meeting.
He formally vetoed it on Thursday. In his 3-page veto message, the governor wrote, "Unfortunately, this budget does not balance, risks potential litigation, and undermines our fiscal stability, educational system, and economic development efforts." He ends by saying, "I cannot overstate the urgency of the need for all parties to come together to negotiate a realistic, responsible budget that addresses our state's fiscal issues, distributes education aid equitably, and balances without the use of illusory gimmicks." Following a third day of bipartisan budget talks with the governor on Thursday, legislative leaders discussed next possible steps, given the governor's veto.
I hope that we can, and we'll continue to talk to reach a bipartisan deal. But eventually, if we don't, on October 10th, the question before the General Assembly is going to be very simple. You have a veto, which you can override, or you're not, and stay with your party, I presume, on the Democratic side, and say we accept the governor's cuts and know that we don't have a budget forthright. So I think that's a very soul-searching question that the legislators are going to have to make on October 10th if we don't have an agreement.
I am disappointed he vetoed this budget. I think there is another opportunity and a responsibility by the legislators in this building to override this veto and move forward. The cuts that have to face this state, education-wise, municipal aid-wise, social service-wise, etc., the list goes on, that this state will face after October 1st are unacceptable, and there is another way to do this.
I think the budget that was passed in both chambers is a terrible budget for the state of Connecticut. It'll have a toxic effect on our economy and our institutes of higher learning. And it is incumbent upon us to not only the governor to veto it, which he did, for us not to overturn the veto. But there are things that we agree to, and there are things within both of our budgets that we agree to. There are big things left. We should be in that room concentrating on it, not talking about a veto override, because that budget is imperfect, just as our budget that we are going to vote on was imperfect.
I think that the governor, in his veto message, I think has succinctly laid out all of the reasons why the budget that was passed is a bad budget, not the way for the state of Connecticut to go. I agree entirely with the speaker on that. I think it would be a bad mistake for us to have that budget go into effect, and would certainly encourage everyone to sustain the governor's veto on it.
Governor Malloy, meanwhile, stood by his veto on Thursday.
How badly do you want to damage the state? So it's been vetoed. Let's get a budget.
And he addressed opposition from some municipal leaders who say the governor's executive order, come October 1st, would be far worse than the Republican budget.
I think there's a mischaracterization of the executive order. The executive order is not a budget. It's not a final product. It is something that is designed to get us through the immediacy of not having a budget immediately. I said that in the room. I'll say it here. I don't like it. But what's interesting, and I said this to my Republican counterparts, you know, if we run the state by executive order, we'll save $1.5 billion in spending. We spend about $5.2 billion supporting local government. It represents 25% of our total expenditures. People have adopted a position that we can only cut everything else, that we can only impact everything else. At the same time, they would argue that we need to stay on the road that we have in improving outcomes in our urban environments. At the same time, we have to set aside hundreds of millions of dollars of additional payments for pensions because someone else didn't fund that. It doesn't work.
With Connecticut now the only state in the nation without a budget in place, Governor Malloy says he remains hopeful a budget he can sign will pass.
To go to sleep at night, I have to believe that there are enough people in this building to put a budget together, because I think in the absence of that, we're doing great damage to the state. So I want a budget. I very much want a budget.
Looking ahead, the governor and legislative leaders plan to meet again on Monday. There was no special session this week to vote on the hospital tax deal since the administration's negotiations with the Hospital Association were still ongoing. Since the governor vetoed the budget that passed in the legislature, the state constitution allows the legislature to attempt to override that veto. That action could come in mid-October.
Okay, our matter for today is Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education Funding versus REL.
On Thursday, the state Supreme Court heard arguments in the state's appeal of a landmark CJEF versus REL education funding ruling, delivered by Hartford Superior Court Judge Thomas Mukauser just over a year ago.
The state spends billions of dollars on schools without any binding principle guaranteeing that education aid goes where it's needed.
The original lawsuit in this case was filed in 2005 by the Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education Funding against then-Governor Jody Rell. The claim was that education funding in Connecticut was inadequate and particularly harmful to students in the high-poverty school districts of New Britain, Bridgeport, Danbury, East Hartford, New London, and Wyndham. In 2010, the state Supreme Court reversed a lower court's ruling to dismiss the case, concluding that every child has the constitutional right to an adequate public school education in Connecticut. When Governor Malloy took office in 2011, he made education reform a top priority with legislation passed in 2012 to redirect more state dollars to the lowest performing school districts. But the plaintiffs in the case were not satisfied, and the trial moved forward last year. After hearing from more than 50 witnesses, Judge Mukauser ruled that Connecticut's current school funding scheme was unconstitutional.
Beyond a reasonable doubt, Connecticut is defaulting on its constitutional duty to provide adequate public school opportunities because it has no rational, substantial, and verifiable plan to distribute money for education aid and school construction.
Judge Mukauser ordered the state to submit to him a new way of funding education in the state. The deadline for that was supposed to be this past March, but it was put on hold until the state Supreme Court could weigh in. Attorneys for both sides argued their points on Thursday morning.
The court's conclusions that the plaintiffs failed to establish that the state does not provide minimally adequate educational opportunities and that the state's funding for education is not constitutionally inequitable are well supported based on the facts presented at trial and credited by the trial court. In fact, the trial court's well-supported findings establish, among many other things, that the legislature from 2012 to 2016 alone, through the Alliance Districts program, poured more than an additional $400 million into only the 30 lowest performing school districts in this state, along with providing countless other supports, professional support, training, all kinds of special assistance and guidance to those districts.
I'll give you a hypothetical. Let's say for all districts to have a minimally adequate educational opportunity, it was $50,000. And all districts had at least $50,000. But Stanford had $50,000 and Greenwich had $10 million. Could that be an equal protection violation?
That's a very complicated question, and it may be that there would
Do you have a simple answer?
It may be that there would be some kind of disparity that might be an equal protection violation, although this court has said in its previous Horton cases that it's not an equal protection violation, that some districts spend more per pupil than other districts, and it's not an equal protection violation that there is an element of local control. In fact, those things are good.
I didn't see him saying that if you adhere to the formula as set forth, which is, as you said, a complicated formula, then there would be no constitutional violation. Did you see that in the opinion?
I think that's what he said,
Oh.
and I don't know any constitutional basis for that, but I think it's what the trial court said.
I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that in some of these, lower performing school districts, the districts themselves, are to varying degrees impoverished. There are all sorts of problems that confront students before they get to school and when they get home from school. And obviously, those issues affect the ability of those students to take advantage of whatever opportunity is presented to them in the school itself. What is the state's position on what, if anything, the state is obligated to do to address those sort of pre-existing issues or problems?
Whatever the state is required to do, it is more than doing by focusing its resources, and its resources in very large amounts, and its resources not only in money, but also in professional supports, in guidance, in programs to develop more minority teachers, in programs to develop more teachers in areas of special need. In all kinds of programs across the board, the state is focusing its resources on trying to provide assistance to the neediest districts and the neediest schools.
The finding I think the trial court made was that taking the state as a whole, looking at its aggregate spending, that it was providing enough money as a state. But the findings of fact, and these are not conclusions, they're findings of fact that are in the opinion itself, indicate that certain districts, particularly the poorer ones, don't have enough resources.
The facts of this case show that there were many multiples of time of resources being spent on students that wasn't spent before. And I asked specifically about the underperforming areas. And Mr. Rubin said that the facts basically show that the children in those districts received more spending from the state than other areas. And I was trying to find whether there was some kind of a disconnect after the state provided the resources, that somehow it wasn't being spent per child in the municipalities. And that doesn't seem to be the case.
I'm not saying that there is some diversion of money that's labeled for education to other uses. The money's being spent on education, but what the evidence shows is that even with this money that is being spent, there are additional resources that need to be provided in the neediest districts.
Let's assume for a second that you prevail and you go back for this hearing. Is your position going to be simply that there's not enough money going, there may be enough money, but there's not enough money going to the poorer districts? Or is your position going to be there should be more money?
Our position is going to be that for these districts, they don't have enough resources.
So there would have to...
We're not going to take a position overall how to fix that until there is a remedy hearing to discuss what the state proposes the fix is going to be.
What did the court do beyond saying to the legislature, make our educational system in this state constitutional?
What did the court do?
Yeah, what specifically did the court say to the legislature as to how to do that?
I think what the court did with respect to the issue that I care about, which is funding, it said that the way you're funding it is not rational. What you need to do is come up with a system that shows how the funding is getting to where the needs are and design a system around that.
The oral argument lasted just over 2 hours. No word when a ruling might come down.
This is a tough one for me.
Prior to the state Supreme Court oral argument on Thursday, the retiring Associate Justice Dennis Evely was recognized. He was elevated from a Superior Court judge to a Supreme Court justice in 2010 by former Governor Jody Rell.
As a member of the Supreme Court, Justice Evely has contributed significantly to the jurisprudence of this state. He has been a panel member in 811 cases, has authored 147 majority opinions, 49 dissents, I thought there were a lot more, and 15 concurrences. In State versus Santiago, Justice Evely authored a concurring opinion in which he examined our capital sentencing structure, concluding that the portions of Public Act 12.5 that allowed men on death row to be executed were violative of the constitutional ban against cruel and unusual punishment. In his concurrence, Justice Evely eloquently wrote that in his opinion, quote, vengeance has no place in the orderly administration of justice by a civilized society, and it certainly can never serve as the justification for the death penalty in today's world, end quote. Dennis is a fundamentally decent man who has respect for everyone that he encounters. And that's also why you're never going to hear anyone say a bad word about him. So, on behalf of all of us, Dennis, thank you for your dedication and commitment to this court, the judicial branch, and your longstanding service to the people of Connecticut.
Thank you, Chief Justice Rogers, for your kind remarks. I can't imagine being surrounded by a more dedicated, more intelligent group of people who are looking to just advance the rule of law in the state. And that has been a great time. I've enjoyed every day of it. And I thank you all for all of your support and your companionship. So, the wheel of life moves on. It's time for me to step aside and someone else will take the seat. And my wish for them is that they enjoy it half as much as I have.
Justice Evely's retirement is effective October 2nd as he reaches the mandatory retirement age of 70.